Okay. Posting a black square on Instagram does not mean you are meaningfully contributing to the Black Lives Matter movement and the fight against the oppression of Black people worldwide. A corporation posting an ad of an athlete kneeling doesn't mean that they care for justice, especially if they are employing slave labor all around the world. We think that performativity, that this emphasis on publicity in activism and in social movements broadly, shields people from accountability and prevents the voices of those who are really experiencing social issues the most from emerging. What do we prefer on opening government? Two things. One, that the voices that are the most heard are the ones that of people who are experiencing these issues or have knowledge about them. Secondly, that people define their contribution to a social movement not by their ability to discuss it necessarily, but by their ability to donate or to act in its favor. Three arguments from OG. First, why performativity and virtue signaling drown out the voices of the oppressed. Second, why it diminishes accountability for actors complicit in these problems. Third, why our counterfactual creates greater change. So, why is it that performativity drowns out the voices of the oppressed? Here I want to ask a crucial question, which is who is doing the most publicity? But not only that, who stands to gain and benefit from that publicity the most? Three groups of people. One, woke moderates or people like college students who would get social value derived from this virtue signaling because they are in an environment where that acts as social cachet. Two, celebrities who can gain wider audiences and followings by having social messages that are just following the trends as they are being produced. Third, about people who are oppressors themselves trying to shield themselves from accountability. This looks like men proclaiming that they're feminists when they've never donated or read about feminist literature, or corporations, for instance, when they're trying to dodge accountability for their corrupt actions. The key framing is this then, is that the people who suffer from these social issues are not the ones who derive the most benefit from virtue signaling. Why? Two reasons. One, because it's generally assumed that they care about these issues and that if they do signal this performance, people expect that of them because of their identity. Second, it's because more attention is given disproportionately to white people, to majoritarian groups with more cultural capital to be able to spread their virtue signaling and performativity primarily through social media. So how does this drown out the voices of the oppressed? Three mechanisms. First is that there is a clear trade-off in terms of who gets publicity and attention, because the people who have the greatest voices are the ones with the greatest existing platforms, the ones who have the biggest social media following, the ones who have the cultural capital and empathy derived from virtue signaling because they're white, and that's something that may or may not be expected of them, like it would be from a group of minority communities. It looks like Taylor Swift, for instance, being the emblem of feminism instead of intersectional feminist scholars or political leaders like Judith Butler or Stacey Abrams. Those are the people who are likely to get the most attention from virtue signaling specifically. Second mechanism is about how information is disseminated. Most of the virtue signaling that we know of happens on outlets like social media, where you want to share short messages that have no depth whatsoever, or to follow with trends or hashtags because you know that that's what's likely to get you the most attention simply because of the fact that that's what's going on and trending on Twitter. It's things that are broadly likely to appeal to messages that make people feel good about themselves when they like something, as opposed to demanding action. The third argument then, more concretely, mechanism rather, is about how you prevent collectivization. This is a crucial example. When white people all over Twitter and Instagram posted black squares during the BLM uprisings in the United States, lots of people were not able to collectivize and get donations anymore because the attention was drowned out by all the millions of black squares that were there that were completely ineffectual and didn't lead to any tangible change whatsoever. And instead, what you lose out on is the capacity for local activists to be able to say, no, I don't want to have a black square today. There are important issues that I want to discuss. There are important sources that I want to add links to so that you can donate to those charities. Those things get actively drowned out by mass virtue signaling, as we saw with the BLM recently. Second argument. Why do you diminish the accountability for actors complicit in these problems? I'm going to divide this into two sections. First, about people who have more power and status in their communities. Second, about corporations. On people. These people who are doing virtue signaling, let's say white men mostly, I would say, are people who derive great social capital, but who also have existing social capital already. And what this does is it diverts accountability for their complicity in the problems that are being created. For example, it's creepy men saying that they're feminists as a way to prevent themselves from being held accountable or called out for their behaviors that might make women uncomfortable. And there is a tangible impact to this. When you see a white man who has tons of virtue signaling over months and months saying that they care about this issue so deeply and they act in a transgressory way towards you, that means that you as a woman feel far less comfortable calling them out because everybody in your social circles who only knows this person primarily through like social media would think, wow, how could this individual take on this kind of action? Look at the history of signaling that they have. We would think otherwise. Second is that these people make themselves seem like authorities on the topics. I know about what the experience of Black women is. Look at my virtue signaling on Instagram, which then means that they're less likely to care about the opinions of those who might be contributing more to their views, but they feel like they have enough to share on social media. CO.
So just to clarify, what are these people going to do instead?
As I said in my intro, we prefer that they would donate to these movements or they don't speak at all and silently favor them, do likes, things like that, but not post about their virtue signaling. Those are the things that we would support. Second, on corporations, there is a trade-off on media attention here about whether the media focuses an article on the BLM movement and the actions of Nike in supporting Colin Kaepernick, or an article that is contrary to that about their uses of slave labor throughout China and the Middle East. Those are the things that are likely to be traded off on their side, which is also important to note because they have massive media empires. So now when you remove the expectation that they should be virtue signaling, you make a clear avenue through which you can contest them as opposed to being drowned out by all the other things. And it's also them being more accountable to create change as opposed to saying, look what we did for you guys. We ran an advert about Colin Kaepernick. Now you have nothing to shield yourself behind, to hide behind. Our counterfactual is preferable for two reasons. One, because you prioritize the voices of people who actually have messages and lived experiences to share and are able to give you avenues through which you can contribute to them. Two, because you don't have people being held unaccountable for their actions we proudly propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the leader of the opposition.
Hello, I'm still audible, right?
Yep.
Cool, just gonna get my timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want to start off by saying that in any type of regrets motion, if you don't actually compare to what a world in which people don't engage with material at all looks like, then you've already lost the debate from open government. Let me be the first team to explain what the comparative looks like, how any incentive exists at all for people to understand the types of movements and types of battles that people are fighting and try to connect with that at all doesn't happen on their side. And while we're probably going to get like more donations and tangible results on our side anyway. A little bit of context on social movements specifically, right? Most often they need money as like a pretty much prerequisite to do anything, right? Whether it's court cases they're fighting, lobbying for political change, using their network to, create safe spaces, do anything, right? All of that is based off of a prerequisite of people understanding their issue and then converting that understanding into money. When we prove that link, we're going to win this debate. Who are the types of people who are going to engage in these public and performative acts, even in our worst case scenario, right? It's people who are probably new to the movement, who are non-committed, or didn't really know this was a problem that they needed to engage with in the past. I think it is unfair to characterize these as folks who are just publicly posturing and are privately against the movement, i.e. this is not people who are like afraid of being canceled, so they're donating, right? This is probably people who are never even exposed to these types of issues growing up. So what is the emphasis that we're trading off against? First, I would posit that there is a minimal trade-off, as the lack of understanding is the primary factor between people not engaging or trying to understand different social movements. But secondly, I just want to note here, this is like sort of tangential, people who use their platform to like amplify voices don't just give their own version of critical race theory, right? Like it's not like Taylor Swift is out here writing essays. It's more so about amplifying other people in the social movement who have done work for decades and decades and trying to give them a platform in the first place. Because in the absence of performative posting, these people would literally be doomed to never be heard from. 3 responses for the comparative alternative action. First, I think volunteering or showing up to a protest is not exactly a substitute because the barrier of entry is significantly higher. There is a greater degree of accessibility to the movement on our side at the point because people can just be like, okay, I donated $5, I'm posting a black square. Okay, more people know about Black Lives Matter. That's, I think, exists on our side as a tangible, discrete benefit. On their side, like, you can't prove that people are going to like teach themselves anti-racism. Secondly, I think the degree to which you are willing to contribute to a movement is how much you care about the movement. I am genuinely unclear as to why they are suddenly more involved on their side of the house, outside of just asserting that smaller group of people would be more involved. Thirdly, we think that performative action in the absence of alternative methods is better because it pushes people who are otherwise not engaged to any movement at all. And secondly, it's going to lead to tangible results. That's what we're going to explain in the next part of our case. Why are these acts beneficial? 3 main reasons. First, on raising awareness. We think that people not being exposed to an issue is a terminal problem that occurs in literally every social movement across the world. A little bit of context. People often do not have the epistemic understanding of the situations that underprivileged groups go through. Privileged groups often cannot even conceptualize the suffering that happens. Also, we have significant status quo bias to our own lived experiences that given that those are the most visceral. When we highlight how bad things are, it targets the information gap that currently exists, or the lack of issue specificity in the contemporary news or discourse around these issues. Because even if you are now exposed to it, people are understanding these issues with a lot more deeper nuance than before. Why is this true? Because often news media gatekeeps a lot of these social movements entirely, i.e. the amount of time that Black Lives Matter got pre-Kaepernick to post-Kaepernick or pre-George Floyd to post-George Floyd is significantly different. The average citizen has no awareness of abstracted things they don't interact with and thus don't even talk to other people about it, right? It never bleeds into general discourse, i.e. explaining white privilege leads to tough conversations in the workplace or with your family that you might previously have never thought about talking. What are the impacts here? It's not just about an automatic difference of less stereotyping, but at least there is a possibility of empathy developing on our side. Understand that social capital is not a static value, right? It is able to be expanded over time as it bleeds into general conversation and people are feeling more comfortable to engage with it. Also note here that a big problem with the understanding gap is that people feel like afraid to engage with these topics, right? Race in America and a lot of countries around the world is just a stigmatized issue because people don't feel comfortable engaging with these issues. We solve that. Secondly, on money. We think that even the most minimal performative actions involve getting like small dollar donations for 2 main reasons. 1, people want to feel like they have made a difference. They like to think they are good, moral people, and it's tied to actually helping minorities. Secondly, there is significant pressure to donate because of both the fear that you will be called out. I want to use the same Blackout Tuesday example, right? There was significant backlash right after from communities, specifically people of color, saying you can't just post a black square on Instagram and not do anything. We have backlash as a mechanism built into a performative world. We'd argue that this leads to higher donations on our side. This is why you see trends where corporations try to match donations that their employees make to bail funds or anti-racism organizations. This is why you see average people who have literally never conceptualized or even know what a bail fund is being like, maybe my company's matching it. Sure, maybe I'll throw in $5. That is important. Next, let's respond to giving a voice to minority communities. I think a key feature of performative acts are retweeting or sharing posts that are not just your own original content, right? Original posts from minority communities are often silenced or buried by social media companies entirely because they no longer have an avenue to have their voices amplified. This looks like retweeting books written by Ta-Nehisi Coates or about anti-racism, or giving Clint Smith a platform on Twitter to spread the message about police brutality. Blackout Tuesday, sure, might have silenced the vast majority of corporate Twitter, but it shows why you don't get the comparative on their side. I'll take closing before I move on. Cool. Why do we think this is necessarily important? 2 main reasons. First, minority activists are often never recognized or amplified when there's significantly a higher barrier to interact with this type of material. Secondly, you don't get brownie points, or even in the worst case scenario where people are like, I don't care about Black people at all. Even in that scenario, when when you retweet this type of material, it initiates this natural discourse that would have never happened regardless, right? It's like why books written about anti-racism 10 years ago exploded in popularity right after the George Floyd protest, because people tried to recognize these types of activists. I don't get any type of substantive analysis from the Prime Minister as to why minority communities are more silenced now than before. Sure, there are other people speaking out on issues, but I would argue that in order for a social movement to actually gain traction, for people to accept that, safe spaces probably need to be there, or that if there's a court case going on, that I need to support it. I think the backbone of power for social movements does not come from liberal woke activists doing whatever they want. It is from the average citizen deciding that they want to spend their hard work money or their time and effort to supporting this movement. Evan is going to flag later on corporations and politicians, how we hold people accountable, but turning the average citizen over to our side is what performative activism does. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
I want to talk about three things. First, I'm going to talk about the opening opposition case. Secondly, I want to talk about discourse. And finally, I want to talk about accountability. Before that, the quick challenge on the comparative. I think there's two options in terms of what the comparative is. The first is, if people truly did care about this movement and they are not practicing performative wokeness for the purpose of self-interest, then they're equally likely to throw their support behind this movement either way. They're likely to donate either way. I think the main group of people that this motion actually affects is specifically the ones that only do performative wokeness. And I think this is a really important characterization dealing with a lot of op case. Because even in our worst case scenario, in which these people are entirely silent, we're going to prove to you throughout our case and weighing a lot of Gautier's material why even if they're completely silent, that is still a significantly better role. On to refutation 200. The first claim that we get is about more donations. The problem is there's very little incentive analysis about who is being performatively woke, because performative wokeness is inherently self-interested. It's inherently like the reason why you would only be performatively woke and not just regular woke is purely because you find that you can get social capital out of it. What's the implication of that? First of all, the implication of that is that you are not willing to sacrifice, i.e. you're not willing to give to this movement more than you are gaining from this movement, meaning that the donations that opposition talks about are non-existent for the people that are being performatively woke. How many of the people that are actually like posting black squares on Instagram are actually donating? The second thing I want to note about this, though, is that these are not people that are likely to post about the books that opposition wants to talk about, because once again, they're not willing to sacrifice their time to this movement as well. These are people rather that are just posting the black square because that is what is trendy on Instagram as well. I want to note that there's a principal problem here too, because what performative wokeness allows for is the ability of people to gain social capital and gain an advantage within their own lives in their own social circles. But this gaining of social capital is built off of the subjugation of somebody else. It is built off of profiting off of the subjugation of somebody else. The reason why we care about Nike profiting off of slave labor is because there is a principled issue here in which you gain simply because of the fact that somebody else is being hurt. The second argument we got was about awareness. But this is the issue, right? We do not live in a world in which Black Lives Matter is not talked about. We don't live in a world in which Black Lives Matter is not aware to the general public. The question then is, where do you get your information from? And where do you get your awareness from? Because even in Op's best case scenario, in which we do have less awareness, I would still prefer that the first time somebody heard about the issues that women face and the gender pay gap did not come from Taylor Swift, but came from a policymaker or came from somebody that made this decision instead. Perhaps media spends less time on it, true, but even in that instance, I want the first time that feminism is discussed, even the first time someone has contact with it, to be academically driven. The second thing I want to note about this, though, is it's easier to attack this movement as well when it is that it's not seen as academically driven. There's a reason why conservatives buy into the whole facts don't care about your feelings narrative, because they think the majority of people that support this movement are uninformed and only being performatively woke, meaning they're less likely to throw their support behind this movement. So if awareness is something that we're worried about to get the moderates are far more likely to buy into the conservative conception. The final thing I want to note, though, is that people that have lived experiences are far better actors to be able to bring forth the topic in the very first place. The final thing, though, is that if anything, I think you get better awareness on our side. Let's say that there's like 7 posts about BLM in your world, and there's like 3 on ours. The 7 posts about BLM in your world are all the black squares. In ours, because of the media trade-off, those 3 posts are about actual issues and actual policies and brought by actual activists, and it is not drowned out in the same way that the Black Lives Matter hashtag was drowned out by all of the black squares. The next thing they say is, oh, but backlash isn't great. The problem is that you cannot use backlash as a mechanism, because as we identified in our accountability argument, you cannot call somebody out of fear that you alienate them from this movement as well. You can't say that because they can say and always defend themselves. Look at all the other social media posts that I made. It makes it significantly harder for that backlash to happen. On discourse, they say, oh, we normalize discourse. But I think they confuse the quantity of discourse with the benefits of quality of discourse. There is a trade-off in the debate. The trade-off in the debate is one of media attention. Perhaps we get less media attention, but the question is who is going through with that media attention? When we talk about something such as feminism and the gender pay gap, we would far prefer a world in which it was not based off of the people that had the largest platforms already. The second thing I want to add to this here, though, is that oftentimes this drowns out more radical ideologies as well. So for example, when corporations massively funded Pride, one of the things that they did was they stopped Pride from allowing a gaze against Israeli apartheid to be marched alongside it. They threatened to withdraw funding. And that's because they oftentimes are able, through performative wokeness, to co-opt many of these organizations and make sure that only the issues that they want to be talked about are the ones that are talked about. And when many of your supporters are following along with this performative wokeness, they gain more and more control over this movement. The BLM example that Gautier identifies is important because while it might sound like a small impact to say, oh, it hurts the ability to collectivize, I think it's emblematic of a larger problem, which is that the authentic and real issues are not discussed. Final argument then, on accountability. Let's be very clear. It is pretty stupid to be performatively woke if I did not care about this movement, unless I have something to gain from it. And that is what the accountability argument is. Sexist individuals, many of them, are pretty clever in the way that they manipulate. They manipulate by identifying themselves as a good person first so that all other critiques against them don't happen. And it's the exact same way in which corporations functions inside the status quo. Because corporations know that there is limited media attention about Nike. The question then is the limited media attention about Nike based off of the fact that they supported Colin Kaepernick or based off of the fact that they have done awful things in other countries? Perhaps opposition will say, oh, but you call them out for being hypocrites. But people have made this calculus. They made this decision. And the reason why they made this decision was because they knew performative wokeness was able to shield them from the accountability that was desperately needed, something that these movements desperately need to be able to do. Money and awareness is not the calculus in this debate. Even if we get less, we get better. That's why we stand on OG.
Cool. I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the deputy leader of the opposition to continue the case.
Can I be heard okay?
Yeah, you're clear.
Two broad things I want to talk about. Firstly, why activism is directly beneficial as a result of this, and secondly, the long-run impacts. Firstly, let's talk about direct benefits. The first thing I want to note is on fundraising. We know that there is a greater incentive to donate when the acts are public for a number of reasons. First of all, because there is now peer pressure to donate, right? It's not just that you are unwilling to do so, but the fact that every one of your friends are posting on Instagram that they need an additional contribution. And when you are not there, when other people are posting about their donations, but you are not, then often it looks very bad on yourself because it's seen like you are not being a participant in the movement that is often seen as a social good. They say, well, based on the premise of this motion, the people we're talking about will be unwilling to contribute. Yes, it's true that people will be unwilling to contribute, but these people are also those who are very unwilling to look bad in front of their friends, people who are very unwilling to be embarrassed. And the crucial component about why public acts are important is because they have increasingly made things like donations easier, right? To say you don't have to like go out and sacrifice an entire day on the streets in order to contribute to a movement. All you have to do is enter a few buttons on your phone in order to make a meaningful difference. And that type of massive pressure is something that has uniquely occurred because these donations are public. The second thing I would note is that often public fundraising demands proof, right? So now on their side, people can just say like, oh yeah, sure, I've contributed before. But on our side, it's often not enough to do that. You have to show the proof and show screenshots of you actually contributing to a specific bailout fund, right? And those things mean that you can now no longer get away with like having some claim of just automatically saying we're going to get better. The second thing they said is that you aren't allowed to use backlash because you fear alienating people from your movement. Like, presumably speaking, you would only fear alienating people from your movement if you thought that those people were like actually productive members. So if someone was doing nothing, it would be unclear how that would be the case. But the second thing I would note is that you are more likely to fear losing people from your movement when you have a significantly smaller movement, right? When you're seen as significantly more fringe and each additional member matters a lot more. On our side, when the vast majority of the public is already behind your movement, losing additional people means significantly less. And that's a big reason why backlash has been empirically a large reason in incentivizing people to donate, because they fear the fact that you're gonna get called out. And that when people only post a black screen, they are called out. When people say this is literally the only thing you've done, that's clearly not enough to actually help these people. That is what incentivizes fundraising in the vast majority of cases. We get significantly more money from a subset of people who do nothing on their side of the house. They say, oh, who cares? This trade-off is fine. But this really does matter, right? Because the millions of dollars that we were able to get from Black Lives Matter in the past months was money that directly went into helping minorities, and to doing things like funding court cases, and to doing things like ensuring that they could access bail so they could like do their job and survive on the streets and give food for their family. Like, this is money that literally helps minorities in the most tangible way and should be the #1 priority of the social movement. So on that alone, we already win this debate. Second of all, let's talk about accountability. They tell us that powerful people now have the plausible deniability that of like saying like they're not actually oppressing people. The first thing I would know is that regardless of whether or not this is public, people are likely to say they're anti-racist, right? Like, no one's going to say I'm not a feminist, or no one's going to say I'm not like a supporter of like minority rights, right? And so given that is the case, the comparative difference is very small. But the second thing I would note is that it is deeply unclear why victims would not be able to call these people out. Like, call-outs are actually, I think, more effective when you are able to say, look at the front that this person has put on. This person is specifically hypocritical, right? Someone who has claimed that they are a supporter of the movement, but who has done things that clearly show they are not, right? And that type of massive call is something that's more effective, because now you not only make people mad at the fact that someone's a racist, but that's a racist pretending to be like they're not a racist, which is often something that makes people significantly more angry at this individual, and that makes backlash significantly more effective. The final thing I would note is that like the impacts of this are unclear, right? Often, plausible deniability among powerful people always exists, and the capacity for you to actually change their behavior is quite limited in the vast majority of cases. Given this is a relatively small impact. Even if it's a principled win, we don't think it's the most important thing in this debate. The second thing they say is that corporations can now claim they've done enough by posting advertising. Here's the difference. Once corporations have explicitly staked their support for a movement, it makes it significantly easier to put pressure on them to do additional steps. So once they've already like put out an advertisement of Colin Kaepernick and have already aligned themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement, now you can have reporters, you can have the public calling them out and saying, what have you done in the recent months to show your support, to show that you've actually helped these people? On their side, when these movements are significantly smaller, because they do not capitalize on the virality of these types of public acts, it means that they can now say, well, I'm not actually sure whether I'm part of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm not sure whether I'm pro Black Lives Matter. In the same way that the NFL was actually quite agnostic prior to the past few months after the killing of George Floyd. So that's actually a comparative benefit, because on their side, they can literally just choose not to affiliate themselves, and they receive very little backlash for it because people don't care in the vast majority of cases. Second of all, finally, let's talk about support for the movement, right? And this is where I move into my long run analysis. I want to be very, very clear. We first talked about how voices are changed on our side of the house in a number of ways. The first one is that the first reason to know is that they say people share hollow messages. This is untrue. The first thing to know is that people generally want to be seen as credible. And one way of seeing credible is having like primary documents, of referring to primary authors, of like referring to minorities' own lives. And secondly, people, if they are as lazy as they say, are unlikely to type out messages, right? They can just do things like reshare or retweet a post from an actual minority, which often means you gain massive traction. This also leads into the comparative quite nicely, because they tell us that white majorities now get the spotlight and minorities don't. The first thing to note is that when these majorities get the spotlight, this often benefits minority as well, because once they see these majorities talking about these minorities, that's often when the attention of the fan base or of the people who view these majorities focus now on minorities who otherwise would not have captured the attention span of these people. But the second thing to know is that your comparative is profoundly unlikely per your own analysis, right? Given these majorities are people who already control the media lens, it is deeply unclear how minorities would ever get interviewed on your side of the house. Second of all, let's talk about supporter base. We crucially get significantly more understanding, right? They tell us that Black Lives Matter is already talked about. Like, this is just not true. First of all, because many social movements are not as prominent as Black Lives Matter. Like, look at ALS, for example, that was only be able to become prominent through performative acts. But second of all, that Black Lives Matter literally in the past few months has gained unseen prominence specifically because of the performative acts, right? The fact that it's showing up on every single person's social media. So now the trade-off is that people who would have done nothing in their world are people who are actively contributing, and people who didn't know anything are now people who are likely, in some cases, to become active supporters in the long run. What does this mean? This is massive impacts, specifically in the political realm. And the reason why is because politicians build their platforms based on what they think is important to people. On our side of the house, even if people don't actually care about these movements, the fact that everyone's posting about it, the fact that it's talked about, makes politicians believe like these issues are important nonetheless, right? And this is critically important because now it means that politicians are increasingly likely to build their platforms around these minority issues when otherwise they would not be seen as important at all. They just say in response that conservatives can call your movement anti-academic, right? I think they are less inclined to do so when these movements are seen as widespread, when a significant proportion of the population is all behind this movement. But thirdly, that on your side, they can just call them radical because no one supports them except for the very, very extreme minorities, right? In that case, I think it's comparatively worse in terms of their publicity. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and now I call upon the member of government.
Can people hear me?
Yeah, you're clear.
Okay, cool. And I'll take POIs in the chat, but if it's at the 5:30 mark and I still haven't taken one, feel free to unmute yourself to make sure I do take one. Because sometimes my internet is slow and the chat doesn't catch up to it. The thesis of our extension is simple. We are going to focus more on what happens in the daily life, both towards the people who are oppressed in society and the people who are supposed allies who do things like virtue signaling. We think this extension matters more because our impacts are much more measurable and tangible because they're not about nebulous concepts like, is the movement getting bigger, is it not, etc., but just things that are less likely to be a wash. We also think that daily impacts just matter more generally because social interactions are a lot of the ways in which people face discrimination. And we also think if legal impacts are going to matter, we all think the types of interactions that people have with each other are what drives them to consider whether or not we should change legal or structural things, i.e. it's not just do you have general contact with a person of color, but what is the actual level of respect in these types of conversations and how much do you focus on them within these conversations? Before going into our major points of extension, just a brief discussion of what we think the likely alternative is if you don't have these sort of systems of virtue signaling. We think that there's still going to be a desire for people to get the social cachet of being woke for a few reasons. First, we think society has just generally gone more in a liberal direction over time. Secondarily, we think identity politics and things like this are still likely to be a thing. And this is, thirdly, mostly caused by things like minority populations are just growing overall, i.e. that there are more immigrants going to the country, that there are more people of color in the country, and that also things like LGBTQ plus movements, more people are coming out, etc. This rebuts the idea that we get from OO that says the only way politicians care about things like this is if you have virtue signaling in the first place. No, they're likely to just care about these issues because a greater number of their voter base identifies with these issues in the first place. We think that when you need a social cachet or still desire the social cachet of being woke, but now don't have the avenue of having it done through publicity, that you need to do things in a more informal way that over time and over depth of interactions is going to get you the idea of being woke. This is things like going to a lot of meetings, but not posting about it on social media. In order to get the social cachet of being woke in those cases, you need to go to a lot more meetings so that people in community therefore know that you were woke, or do things like donate a lot so that therefore people still get the signal that you were woke, but you can't just post one screenshot of doing it, but then literally not donate another time until 2 years later, there's another massive police brutality thing. We therefore think that you both rebut the OO idea that money is like the utmost thing that matters, and therefore something they can only get on their side of the house because you actually get more donations on our side of the house. But even if you don't buy the fact that we get more donations, just recognize the fact that like social movements can exist with or without the virtue signaling. This is like why things in the 70s and 60s were still able to have civil rights movements, even, and therefore like money might be a prerequisite, but it's like, even if you don't buy the fact that we get more donations, you probably still meet the prerequisite level to get the movement going, etc. Now, what happens to people who are actually affected by the social justice issues? First, we think they're going to be largely discouraged or face a lot of cynicism when these sorts of virtue signaling things happen, because you hear a lot about people supposedly supporting you, but literally nothing in your life is changing. So you get more discouraged about your place in society. Secondarily, we think publicity narratives and virtue signaling also put more of an emotional burden or work on people of color or people who are oppressed. This is because that oftentimes the way publicity narratives are materialized is things like saying, oh, I have a Black friend, or I'm asking their opinion, or literally movements that have involved apologizing to people of color who you have harmed, and therefore they have the emotional burden of needing to like absolve you publicly on social media. We think that these types of interactions make your life meaningfully harder and are a distraction from real things that you care about, such as like, how do I talk about structural issues in society, or how do I approach things on a societal level, rather than just like, how do I deal with my annoying friend who keeps asking me to absolve their white guilt? We also think that you're just more likely to be more hurt because now you have the expectation that people in your life are woker than they actually are. I think, for example, men in debate do these things a lot, that they signal that they are woke and that they care about women on their team, but then they don't actually do things like partner with women or tell them that they support them or like help them through things like equity complaints. This is meaningful because now you are more hurt given that you had the expectation that they would help you in the first place. But secondarily, you also are prevented or like don't realize that you should have been doing things independently to form safe networks that would actually help you. This is things like not having as many gender minority nights or socializations because you didn't think it was important because everyone kept telling you on your team that it was not a problem that men on debate weren't that bad, or things like, oh, I'm not going to build allyship circles because you will tell me it is unnecessary since I already have like white allies. So like, why do I need to do things like have diversity circles, etc.? We therefore think people's lives get meaningfully harder on their side of the house. Before I'll go on, I'll take a point of POI from OO.
The only way that politicians will believe that something matters to the public is if they reveal that preference in some way. How is that the case when no one publicly vocalizes social movements and their support for them and their advocacy for them, and all of it's just like under the radar on your side of the house?
I think like you can still see things like voting patterns over time that like politicians will pay attention to. And even if it's not public, you like know that like your voter base is getting to be like more people of color. So they're probably going to vote for policies that are progressive. I don't think that's like so secret that it's not going to be obvious to politicians. Second argument, what happens to allies and buy-in generally? We think that you get less buy-in from people that you want to add, i.e. that like there are certain people who are going to be performative, but they were going to be liberal anyways. But what happens now is that people who are on the edges think things like call-out culture are stupid because people they care about are literally being called out. But the problem with call-out culture is that it's a form of virtue signaling that also allows no form of redemption. This means that people feel like the movement is stupid because it doesn't allow for actual change, and therefore they want to distance themselves from it. Secondarily, they get a lot more information overload from these things because everyone performs themselves to be woke without actually giving information. Secondarily, we think that people on the whole are just far less reflective, i.e. that people who are allies can just blame other people or call out other people for bad actions, but in reality, it's true that like every man contributes to the patriarchy and every white person is contributing to things like racism. We think without this performative activism, and you have to actually manifest in yourself the belief that you could be contributing these things to the first place, and therefore you have to deal with it and focus on things internally and actually fix your behaviors. And lastly, we just think that a lot of the messages that these allies get are just plain wrong. We think this also rebuts the lack of understanding argument from opening opposition. We think they are wrong because people get information from their own circles, which are mostly other like white ally types and not people actually from the movement. What this then means is that they are going to do things like have changes that preserve their ability to advance in society while signaling that they're unbiased, such as things like having race-blind advocates or people saying that we should like make Muslim women be like liberalized from their oppression, things like that don't actually help people who are oppressed, but just absolve them of their guilt.
Cool. I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the member of the opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, just give me a second to turn on the lights so I can see my notes. Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. You can expect 2 points of novel substantive coming from closing opposition. Firstly, we're going to give you the most important argument by explaining that this is the only way that movements could have stayed together in the modern day and they would have dissipated and vanished otherwise. And secondly, we will explain why this motion is probably symmetric, which means that all other teams' impacts are not really that important. We're explaining why if both sides of the spectrum use it, so if both conservatives and liberals use it, why it would be better for liberals presumably and make a more egalitarian society. Before that though, direct response to marginalize all of Gov's harms. Firstly, the harm from opening government about getting co-opted or drowned out. Firstly, this just feels marginal. Like, yes, there might be more black squares, but nobody is going around sharing mostly black squares on Facebook. The ones that get shared most often are the ones that opening government wants to share. Nobody's putting the black square on Instagram on the news over the video of George Floyd. Secondly, beyond that, being greeted with an in-depth policy position, if we believe opening government's point is correct, as your first encounter with the movement can often be off-putting and inaccessible. The great thing for publicity is that it is often tailored for virality and accessibility. It gets people interested first. OG guarantees perhaps that the quality of discourse is higher, but not buy-in. It's insofar as they prove that they might have a more in-depth policy discussion. It's not. They don't prove why they get more people in the movement. So that point disproves most of their impacts. Secondly, on the point of being co-opted by corporations, one, if an ex-corporation wants to stop a rally, they will want to stop it either way. This facade of support is the only difference between pulling funding, which is not that bad, compared to having strike breakers called on you and getting the police called on you. Secondly, additionally, publicity comparatively allows for movements to have more power against corporations and governments. Governments and corporations can't check if each black square profile picture is a genuine person that might be willing to vote a certain way or boycott a certain way, which is why they're more likely to walk on eggshells around these movements because they carry considerably more social power. That's opening government out of this debate. What about closing government? So, firstly, I think a lot of their harms, such as call-out culture, such as getting things wrong, are not very mutually exclusive. Insofar as you will probably stay within your network of friends either way. The difference maker here, we believe, is one, we think publicity is considerably more international and broad and expands the surface area by which you receive interactions with other individuals. The reason for this, one, is because publicity means that, the publicity part of the motion means that social movements are more likely to coordinate with news agencies, to be heard, etc., 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 which means that more things are heard about the successes of other movements in other places. The second thing, notably, is that the part about calling people out and it just is not part of their side of the motion. Like something that is purely performative. Note that performative expressivism refers to an expression of stance that does not lead to action or correlate with that action in any further way. If calling out people leads to like some form of accountability or some form of some person getting harmed, then that leads to some form of action. So by definition, their side is the one defending that. Okay, after having established that, I'll prove why Gov doesn't get the counterfactual correctly in my argument. Firstly, on performative expressivism. So here I'm going to play within the space that all other teams discuss about where do movements succeed more. The first thing we want to point out is that the present day situation for most activists is one of fatigue. Take heed. OG debates the performative actions taken by people that don't really care about the movement. But performative expressivism also refers to expression of stance, opinion, and belief of the people that genuinely believe in the movement. For many of these people, these actions are really, really important, even if it's just changing your profile picture. But in many cases, it could be rallies for the express purpose of celebration and no other purpose. It could be gathering as a party, gathering to celebrate a certain action. We believe that these expressions of your stance and your belief and your identity are also important. First subpoint, we believe activism currently is inherently unsustainable. 3 sub-reasons. 1, it's exhausting, it's time-consuming, costs money, and a day that could have been spent with your family, your loved ones, doing the things that you enjoy is instead spent on the streets, shouting at people that refuse to listen. Secondly, it's disheartening. Most actions fail, regardless of whether or not there's an emphasis on action, because of the fact that election cycles take long, because most people are comfortable in the status quo, and social movements are often a minority in most parts of the world. This means that in any action that you take has a high high chance of failure regardless of what you do. Thirdly and lastly, it's often dangerous. You might get shot, beat up, tear gas when you go out in the streets. Where I live in the Philippines, some people go out to rally and are found at the bottom of Manila Bay. In a BLM protest, you might get arrested. In a Hong Kong protest, you might get shot. This means that activism normally without this part of the motion would be really, really difficult to sustain. People are likely to leave the movement. People are not likely to stay insofar as they might believe it is a good thing, but not worth it for them to continue to pursue. All these points mean that the activism of action is one of great difficulty. This means that conventionally, you would see less people in movements year after year. But the reason why this did not happen in status quo and why social movements have ballooned to heights never seen before is for three structural reasons. One, the activism of publicity gets normalized in status quo today, lowering barriers and increasing access to people all around the world. The value of performative expressions in the mainstream, especially by celebrities, but also by those that have high social political capital, is that it becomes more acceptable for people to themselves express their stances and beliefs as role models, and those with social political capital pave the way for others. It becomes easier for you to say what you believe in front of your friends and your conservative family. Publicity also writes in the slogan of accessibility, catchy punchlines, songs that speak of suffering, rest in power, like and Rage Against the Machine and Eminem's Kamikaze. The importance of publicity is that it's normalized and becomes acceptable for you to present yourself and go farther into the movement. This means that people that would not have otherwise joined are now unlocked. Secondly, social movements let you feel hope. Insofar as you take actions in a social movement to pursue a social good, people only do things if they believe that things are going somewhere. You push people to take action, but refuse to celebrate, publicize the results, and you refuse to let them rejoice and celebrate them for being themselves. These celebrations and simple expressions of who you are and what you believe in are what make people feel like success is possible and what make people feel like the movement is worth fighting for. The third and last thing is that you create a community. One is that when you go to a pride rally, you viscerally see the sheer amount of people that agree with you, that are celebrating with you. You see all the people that share your profile picture, all the people that share your hashtag, all the people that broadly believe in the same idea as you. All these points mean that movements are far more likely to stay together in a context that makes it impossible for them to do so. Opening government.
Most people that support the movement are going to still express this on either side. This debate happens about people that are exclusively performatively woke. And there's a lot of analysis on what they can do, not what they will do. These people gain more than they lose. That is why they are unlike, that is why they have all the accountability harms and harms of awareness.
Anyway, look, the first point is that this is about generally performative expressivism. You can't regret it for only the worst possible people. It's unclear why that's the case. Additionally, I gave reasons as for why it will also affect these people. Anyway, last point. So before that, though, I've already won the debate. But the second and last point is just most movements are symmetric. It's not sufficient for both sides to say that social movements succeed more insofar as there are social movements that are both conservative and oppressive on either side. What our side does is, one, it creates an expression of stance and belief that makes it easier for people to criticize one another because you said your stance in public and you can't change it on the fly to simply attack someone else and make it easy to defend. Additionally, this expression also makes it such that you as an individual supporter right now can choose and pick between political stances and political movements that you might want to support. This means that there's comparatively more political engagement, people are more engaged in the political system, and there's more representation overall. So at the end of this speech, we've done two very, very basic things. First, advance, and second, take the first. For these reasons, negate.
I thank that speaker for their speech and now call upon the government whip.
Hi, sorry. Would you mind if I rescinded my consent to be streamed?
I'm not handling that. Is someone from OrgCom here?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I will stop the stream just a second to do that.